Thanks again for joining this webinar. Hopefully some of you have joined previously. As Valerie mentioned, we've done several webinars previously over the course of the last 3 years of our tenure as a data resource center for the program. Today I'll try to just review where we are and contextualize it a bit, and then turn it over to Vincent Ferretti, who has really been leading some of the portal-based developments, and he'll highlight additional features that we've been developing. To provide you a little bit of context, most of our efforts really center around this overarching methodology that we try to bring to the Kids First data resource infrastructure and practices, really recognizing that we have to cover this end-to-end solution that empowers the transition from local based efforts, oftentimes undertaken by investigators or their consortia, to really providing the platform-based initiatives, this translation of those samples and the data generated from those samples by the sequencing centers into structured information that can then be harnessed by the community for knowledge creation and ultimately patient impact. And part of the reason I wanted to remind those of you who haven't, or if you have joined before, but remind the audience of our methodologies, because you'll hear also later from the Common Fund data ecosystem. And one of the most exciting things that's taking shape within the NIH landscape is really this double funnel paradigm that we've been trying to embrace, where on the front end of the research lifecycle, especially within the Kids First data resource, you see this large diversity of investigators, data sets, disease contexts being intersected and brought together in ways that harmonization provides a narrowing of opportunity for discovery across the platforms. But then at the same time, the platforms are supposed to, if we're successful, expand the use of such data and expand the impact of such data through greater access to the community. But what's also exciting is through interoperability with other platforms. And it's really through this life cycle that we think we can really drive accelerated impact on behalf of children, really in alignment with the mission of the program. And so it's really beginning in that first phase of taking large-scale data generation efforts that are still ongoing. And one of the more exciting things is that the kind of research that Sharon just highlighted is really moving forward. Valerie also highlighted a few publications that are taking shape. But that's really just the tip of the iceberg, because you'll see that there are release studies and many more studies coming on board. And really, now that the release studies are available, that expands that usage not only to the initial investigators, but also to the rest of the community. So these studies really, as Valerie highlighted and Sharon highlighted, really span disease-specific contexts, but also really integrate across both cancer and non-cancer contexts in ways that's both challenging and filled with opportunity. I tried to summarize just high-level numbers across these different organ system and contexts. And what you can see that this creates some of the most diverse biological contexts for disease in pediatrics, from a whole genome sequencing perspective paired with RNA-seq and some of the long-read studies that are coming up, as well as with the clinical and phenotypic data that's being added to them. Taking that data and really structuring it in a way that's useful, not just for the investigators, but also for secondary use, really takes a combination of platforms that is continually evolving. And at each phase of platform development, we go through a number of cycles of community engagement, of alpha and beta testing, to really assess if we're meeting the needs of the research discovery process. And every one of those cycles is also available for your additional input as a community for continued iteration. And you'll see some of this in Vincent's presentation. Genomic data is, while challenging and large, is not nearly as challenging as the clinical and phenotypic diversity. And we've highlighted some of the tooling around the Kids First Data Resource Center's capacity to handle and empower clinical phenotypic data structuring. And the empowerment is not just at the querying phase for the users, but also on the ingest phase. And I wanted to just briefly highlight this because some of the tooling that spans that life cycle from end to end is not only focused on the portal endpoint, which oftentimes is what we present, but also on the ingest phase. So for example, here you can see many of the studies begin in essentially Excel sheets or some other tabular format that now we are structuring through different toolings that can support both the real-time tracking of those efforts and what hopefully you'll see in the near future are implementation of additional services around the clinical and phenotypic life cycle of data sets in ways that I think is really dramatically empowering. What you have heard at each time that we've had a webinar is some of this translation of information into knowledge by the diverse investigators. Our initial mandate over the first couple of years was really just to empower access and structuring of the data to ensure that this diverse data set is really fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reproducible. But now we're moving into this additional phase of activity that expands the capacity of both investigators as well as secondary users to leverage the platform for additional discovery. Owen highlighted some of the tooling around the analytic workflows in Informatica, but the next phase is to take some of the processing of that data and empower it for querying and hypothesis generation and discovery in the way that Owen and Sharon just described, but more broadly across data sets and across studies. And this is what Vincent will really focus on. He and his team have really been champions of implementing an initial deployment of such tooling as a variant workbench. This is a really significant milestone because it truly empowers the queryability and assessment of very large-scale data sets when it comes to simply the numerical challenge of such a large number of variants across the whole genome context of many of these studies. We're still in the early phases of the deployment of this resource and expect it to really expand rapidly as we engage both the EXO-1 investigators and the rest of the community for further implementation of these toolings. I wanted to, I'll turn the presentation over to Vincent in just a second, but I wanted to again point out this other end of the funnel, really to connect to some of the presentation content that you'll see from the Common Fund Data Ecosystem team, but also contextualize it in a large body of work led by Alison Heath and others from our team, along with the NIH to really empower the interoperability and access of data sets across a number of platforms. And so that funnel of expansion not only pertains to additional investigators and additional studies, but additional platforms. And it's that phase of expansion that is truly exciting because it will open up the doors for Kids First Data Resource users to not only access and utilize data sets within the Kids First environment, but as we have highlighted in the past, it expands to the NCI, NHGRI, NHLBI, and the Common Fund, providing hopefully a really robust architecture for rapid discovery. We oftentimes lead many of these presentations at CHOP, but obviously we couldn't be here without our really amazing partners, one of which I'll turn this over to right now, which is really Vincent from St. Justine. So thanks again, and we look forward to continued engagement in the ongoing development of these platforms and resources and to support the discovery process, not just for the investigators who have done an amazing job at collecting and supporting these large-scale data sets and specimens for their own research, but really empowering secondary users, as Sharon was really doing an excellent job of highlighting, for the use, integration, and analysis of those resources. And please feel free to reach out to any of our support staff via the website anytime.
I don't think we're going to be able to hear Vincent. Is there someone else I can turn it over to?
Sure, I can try and do a very poor job of presenting on behalf of Vincent. This is Adam.
Okay.
And then Vincent, if you join or are able to call in, I'll be happy to turn it over to ensure that you do justice to the presentation. As Sharon and Owen highlighted, there are a number of different analyses that can be done on the whole genome sequencing data sets, including structural variations and variant identification. We began with really trying to develop resources to support variant identification, and importantly, to support such resources that would really span the entirety of the data set in ways that could still support the appropriate access and management and use of those data sets in accordance with the consents that a patient provided, but at the same time empower that discovery in a common environment. So the objective is really to extract, annotate, and then import this variant data as processed uniformly by the Kids First Data Resource Center into a queryable data sets. Now, this is extremely large, big data, and as Vincent highlights here, really requires us to maintain confidentiality and security in alignment with the consent efforts that the investigators themselves initially undertook to bring patient into the protocols. The production version will be released in a coming setting with a phase 1 for EXO-1 investigators, teams to inform the usage and development of these resources between now and November, with the goal to then expand wider use in the early months of 2021. So we'll leverage really the EXO-1's investigators' expertise and knowledge base within their own studies to ensure that across these different resources, data sets, the Variant Workbench can really support the required filtering and annotation and discovery processes that can then be more broadly expanded. Our vision is in the future that this will also be available for investigators, just like Kabatica is, to support the ingest of additional data sets by investigators, harmonizing such data sets and incorporating the investigators' own variants into the context of a broader variant setting in alignment with the appropriate consent and practices and governance. So really bringing these together requires intersecting the variant data sets, and given all the effort we spent in annotating participant clinical data, we want to make sure users can not only query variants, but also intersect with sophisticated variant querying that is mirrored by their activities in the cohort building portal sections that we've demoed in the past. And then we've also integrated additional public variant data sets in order to empower the calculations and understanding of any particular cohort within Kids First. Each user actually has a dedicated instance of a Spark cluster that gets initiated within the Kids First data resource architecture that retains and is persistent across their analyses, as supported by a Zeppelin Notebook implementation in the portal. Next slide. What empowers really this rapid queryability is the organization of the data into a relational database that's tabular in nature. We can continuously add additional tables into this infrastructure that supports really rapid querying across that tabular context within the Zeppelin Notebook in ways that allows for very rapid iteration of hypotheses and variables in the context of pre-structured notebooks, or for those users who have more coding experience, even highly complex, independent, and bespoke notebook context. Next slide. It is a continuous challenge, but also a requirement that, as Sharon and Owen discussed, empowering our discovery always requires a comparative linkage to other existing large-scale variant data resources. And to accommodate that within the Variant Workbench, we have been integrating many of the standard variant annotations from Nomad, Orphanet, Cosmic on the cancer side, TopMed, and then intersecting those with the clinical and phenotypic nomenclatures that are part of our own data sets and annotated by additional programs like the BEP and DB-SNFB. These are the types of underlying resources that we continuously integrate, and as part of the initial development cycle, we'll be looking for additional input as to other resources that should be included as part of the Variant Workbench to support additional discovery. Bringing all of these together allows you to create really complex variant filtration and annotation across not just any single cohort, but across very large data sets within Kids First in ways that can support finding de novo rare missense mutations, those that have high functional impact, those that then intersect within one data set or another, and the relevant frequencies as tabulated across appropriately consented cohorts. Next slide. So currently, we have loaded 11 studies with a little bit more than 11,000 participants. These include almost 300 million unique variants across 53 billion occurrences. Again, these are our goal here is to really provide an initial starting point for the filtration, analysis, and annotation in ways that is dispassionate from the perspective of the Data Resource Center. We wanted to ensure that the appropriate filtration and analyses are really informed by domain experts and investigators. And so really these are the starting points of the outputs of many of our pipelines, but now this environment can support that analysis. So as you can see here, each variant occurs on average 178 participants. Each participant has a very large number of initial called variants that need to be filtered for analysis. And then as you can see, these overlap significantly with other resources like TopMed or Nomad. Next slide. Key to the way that we and Vincent's team have been developing the portal environments is to try and create a singular environment as a starting point for the research activities. So the Zeppelin data analytic environment is actually integrated into the portal environment and is dedicated again as a safe state to the individual who has logged into the portal. And our goal is to make this environment available to any user who logs in to the portal, the same way that Kabatica and the clinical phenotypic data are available for any user at this time to query and create cohorts, recognizing that oftentimes these activities that then support additional data use requests and additional activities. But in order to perform these activities, you will have to have a dbGaP access permission, in contrast to the somatic data from cancer, which the NIH at this time still supports as a accessible data set in the absence of a dbGaP request. Germline variants obviously provide additional risk, and as such, you will still have to have the appropriate dbGaP approval, but any dbGaP approved study that you have can be performed then within the context of the Variant Workbench. Next. We're leveraging the Zeppelin Notebook environment for a variety of strategic and tactical reasons. This includes our capacity to create really standard variant workbench environments as starting point for investigators who may or may not have significant experience with notebook environments, leveraging the graphing and charting capacity innate within the Zeppelin Notebook environment. And then at the same time, allowing more experienced users to really have a very wide range of choices in programmatic language implementations across the notebook environment. This is a continuous challenge within the Kids First Data Resource Center's efforts to really allow both the high expertise of bioinformatician and data scientists, but at the same time, make really complex data approachable to the biologist and bench scientist like myself. it's in this environment that you could then really choose a variety of different analyses, and then at the same time share these analyses, create and store multiple different versions of notebooks, and create a collaborative environment that leverages both your own data as well as the DRC's hosted data sets. We do have initially some pre-installed libraries like Kale, Pandas, and others. But again, as part of the initial alpha and beta phases, we'll look to optimize around those resources as they're available. Next. Here, one of the main underpinnings for us was to ensure that the cohort creating capacity of the portal, which we spent a large amount of time vetting and optimizing, can be leveraged to drive this additional discovery for secondary use. So again, we're entering that secondary use phase of multi-study investigator initiated and hypothesis-driven querying. And so as users create cohorts across data sets that they have access to with the cohort building activities, those cohorts can be saved, shared, and analyzed by multiple users, but then can be handed off as a saved participant set to the Variant Workbench environment. And so this combination of having saved cohorts and saved workflows and environments can be paired in multiple different scenarios, right? So a user can iterate on the cohort creating abilities once they do an analysis to further highlight any feature they detect within a particular cohort, and if vice versa, a user can iterate on the analysis side by pushing a saved participant set into a variety of different workbench workflows. Next. These saved sets essentially are your own personalized cohort that is persistent and allows you to be joined with all the other variant tables for additional genomic analysis. And it's this concept of saved sets as a saved state for a user that we really hope to continuously iterate on and continuously develop a workbench workspace environment for users to return to the portal and analyze. Downstream features that will be implemented that we hope to bring on board include notifications around such saved sets and workflows, such that the dynamic context of ongoing data generation and incorporation into the KidsFirst DRC could be reported to users across their saved sets and or workflows. So you can imagine as we onboard and intersect additional data sets across this highly variegated data landscape, the cohorts themselves and variables initially selected will change, as well as the significance and analyses that are taking shape within the Variant Workbench. And our hope is that having such saved sets and states will allow users to iteratively be notified as the data lifecycle continues and additional data comes into the resource environment in ways that is highly flexible and informative to users. Next. I addressed some of this, and to be transparent, it's one of the most vexing questions that we oftentimes think about within the Data Resource Center. And that's because, to really drive the kind of research you saw from Sharon and Owen really takes a large amount of expertise at the bioinformatic and data science side. But at the same time, the scientific hypothesis generation by biologists, clinicians, and other stakeholders need to be supported. So for us, the workbench is really for, initial data quality control that are rapidly available for any users to assess their data sets. But then we'll also support via standard workbench notebooks, the initial analysis and queryability of data sets or variants. And then ultimately, our hope is to drive the continuous improvement and implementation of much more sophisticated bioinformatic workflows as generated by the community bioinformaticians and data scientists who are SQL, Python, R, et cetera, enabled. So this will be an ongoing experiment within our efforts to really try and provide these services across both QC, initial queryability, across very large number of variants, as well as much more empowered, sophisticated notebook environments. So our next aim is really to increase the user base so that we can both learn and optimize on the deployments of these environments, and users will be able to both change, modify, implement, store, break, and improve upon this implementation. And as Vincent highlights in this last point, it's really a trade-off between sort of standard data portals that have static implementation within their portal environment. Within Kids First, for example, we have a PDC Bio instance that really is a great initial queryable environment, and the much more sophisticated, but oftentimes more limited in terms of its user base environments of programmatic interfaces or command-line environments. So this will be an ongoing effort to really position this workbench across that domain, and features that are reusable and developed within the workbench will also ultimately end up as static and empowered queryable environment within the portal itself. So it provides a great way to pipeline additional implementations for us. Next. So there's, as I've, I think, repeatedly highlighted, is a lot more work to do, including the indexing of variant database with Elasticsearch, building data querying interfaces within the portal itself that leverage the development cycles around the Zeppelin notebook environment, and then also provide more routine, what Vincent calls nomad-like interfaces that return really aggregate high-level views as appropriate for a data set across the Kids First, really growing body of data. And then further integration with the Cohort Builder that allows for complex queries, not just across phenotypes, but across genotypes within the portal itself. So this will be a continuous development cycle that will improve the user experience and hopefully the discoverability of meaningful results. Next slide. So undoubtedly, I did a poor man's job at presenting on behalf of Vincent. Again, apologies to the St. Justine team for the technical difficulties. Hopefully, I did it some justice, but not sufficiently complete. We'll have plenty of more opportunities to demonstrate the use of these portals, particularly in the context of actual analysis on data sets in coming webinars and deployments. But really kudos to the St. Justine team for doing an amazing job for this deployment. Thanks again to the amazing CHOP team for making it possible. And especially thank you to the investigators who, whether or not they knew it, have volunteered to be initial guinea pigs and users of these resources. And we look forward to working with you and the rest of the community as we try to empower much more accelerated discovery across really amazing cohorts of data. Thanks.